Inside the walls of fear, the brutal reality of Pelican Bay Supermax. The year is 2011, deep inside the Security Housing Unit, better known as the SHU, at Pelican Bay State Prison in Crescent City, California. A place designed with one purpose: to break communication, break connection, and break the will of the people inside it. The lights never fully turn off. The silence never truly becomes quiet. And every sound, even a single footstep, echoes like a warning. We open on a cell no bigger than a parking space. Gray concrete. Steel door. Chains on the floor. A man sits on the edge of his thin mattress, breathing slow and heavy. His name is Miguel Alvarez, a real inmate who would later testify publicly about the long-term isolation inside Pelican Bay. After more than 15 years in near-total solitude, his mind has begun to bend under the weight of the silence. But today, something is different. From inside his cell, Miguel hears a faint tapping. At first it sounds like plumbing. Then it becomes clearer. A rhythm. A pattern. Almost like code. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. He freezes. That tapping shouldn't exist. No one in the SHU is allowed to speak to anyone. Not through doors. Not through vents. Not through walls. Communication of any kind is strictly forbidden. Miguel presses his ear against the cold concrete. The tapping continues, louder now, more frantic, more desperate, as if someone is trying to send a message, a warning, through the wall. Then suddenly, it stops. Silence floods the hallway. And right as Miguel steps back, confused, the entire tier erupts with a sound that sends panic through every inmate in the block. The unmistakable thunder of boots sprinting toward his cell. Multiple guards. Fast. Urgent. Yelling codes Miguel can't fully understand. But one thing is clear. They're coming straight for him. Miguel backs up slowly, heart pounding, unsure what is happening, unsure whether he is in danger, or whether something terrible has happened on the other side of that concrete wall. Then, slam. The steel door swings open. The bright white beam of a flashlight hits his face. A voice shouts, "You against the wall. Now." And before Miguel can speak, before he can ask what's going on or why they're there, one of the officers mutters under his breath, just loud enough for Miguel to hear. Something went wrong in 122, real wrong. But Miguel knows exactly who lived in cell 122. A man who had been isolated for decades. A man who complained for years about voices, shadows, and long nights without sleep. A man who, only hours earlier, was tapping frantically on Miguel's wall. The unanswered question hangs in the air, heavy and sharp. What happened in cell 122, and why was someone trying to warn Miguel? To understand what happened inside that cold concrete corridor in 2011, we need to go back. Way back. Back to the creation of Pelican Bay itself. A prison engineered to control some of the most challenging prison populations in the United States. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in December 1989, built on 275 acres of redwood forest near the Oregon border. The location was no accident. The state wanted something remote, far from major cities, far from escape routes, and far from public attention. Inside this isolated facility sits the crown jewel of control. The Security Housing Unit, the SHU. A massive X-shaped complex of windowless concrete, designed for what California officials called the highest-risk individuals, including those accused of gang activity, violence inside facilities, or serious rule violations. But in reality, many men ended up there simply through associations, confidential informant notes, or alleged ties rather than proven acts. Each cell was a world of its own. Solid concrete walls. A steel gate with small perforated holes. No view of the outside world. A fluorescent light that buzzed day and night. A bed, a toilet, and a concrete shelf. No phone calls. No contact with family. No outdoor sunlight, only a dog-run exercise pen with 20-foot concrete walls. By the mid-1990s, Pelican Bay had become one of the most feared names in the American prison system. Reports by Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, and multiple court cases documented the severe psychological effects caused by long-term isolation. In Madrid versus Gomez, 1995, a federal judge declared parts of Pelican Bay's SHU unconstitutional for inmates with mental illnesses, describing the conditions as inflicting cruel and unusual punishment. But for thousands of others, the SHU remained their permanent address. Miguel Alvarez was one of them. Born in Los Angeles in 1971, Miguel grew up in a neighborhood where survival could sometimes feel like a full-time job. By his early 20s, he ended up in the California prison system. Inside, he was labeled as gang-affiliated, a label that, true or not, could follow someone for years. In 1996, Miguel was validated, which meant he was identified as connected to a prison gang. Validation could be based on anything: drawings, books, tattoos, or even someone else's statement. Once validated, many inmates were automatically placed in the SHU, sometimes for decades. Miguel arrived at Pelican Bay that same year. His life shrank to a 8x10 concrete room. At first he thought he would adjust. Most men believe that. They tell themselves they'll be fine, that isolation is just quiet time to think. But days passed. Then months. Then years. He described the experience years later in interviews. After a while, you don't know if it's day or night. Time gets strange. Your mind gets loud. The silence becomes something alive. A presence. A pressure. Miguel created routines to stay sane. Push-ups, pacing the cell, reading old newspapers, talking quietly to himself just to hear a voice. But nothing truly stops the slow erosion of being cut off from the world. The SHU was designed around one philosophy: control through isolation. No phones. No contact visits. Mail heavily screened. No touching another human being except for handcuffs or searches. By the early 2000s, psychologists began publishing reports showing that after months of isolation, many inmates developed symptoms like severe anxiety, hallucinations, insomnia, depression, paranoia, difficulty knowing what was real and what was imagined. For some, the effects were temporary. For others, permanent. Miguel lived through all of it. And over the years, he wasn't alone. Inside the SHU's Pod D10, a neighbor moved into the cell beside him in 2003, the man in cell 122. His name was David Coleman, a quiet man in his 40s who rarely spoke during check-ins. He had been transferred from another California facility after years of alleged conflict with staff. Officers described him as withdrawn but compliant, someone who didn't cause disruptions but seemed to drift further into himself year after year. Miguel and David never spoke directly. They weren't allowed to. But in the SHU, communication becomes an art. A whisper under a blanket. A note slid under a door. A series of taps through concrete. Miguel first heard the tapping in 2007, for years after David arrived. It wasn't code at the time, just faint patterns like a man passing the moments in isolation. But by 2010 the tapping changed. It became messages. Urgent ones. Miguel began to piece together what little he could. David had trouble sleeping. David saw shadows moving when the lights buzzed late at night. David believed the walls were breathing. David said the silence in the SHU was talking back. Miguel tried to respond with gentle taps, mostly to reassure him that he wasn't alone. But even then, communication could lead to punishment if discovered. Then came the strange night in July 2011, the night that opened our story. Miguel had woken up to that frantic tapping, stronger than ever before. Loud. Sure. Terrified. Something was wrong. He leaned against the concrete, listening, trying to decode the rhythm. But before he could figure it out, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was different from the usual silence of the SHU. This one felt heavy. Unnatural. Like a void where something used to be. Minutes later, the pounding of boots filled the hallway. Miguel didn't know at the time, but earlier that day, several inmates had filed declarations as part of a statewide hunger strike protesting long-term isolation. Pelican Bay was under national attention. Security was tight. Tensions were high. Everyone, inmates and staff, felt the pressure. So when officers sprinted toward David Coleman's cell, Miguel's heart dropped. He had no idea what had happened. He only knew something had gone terribly wrong in cell 122. Still pinned to the wall in his own cell, cuffed and confused, Miguel could hear distant voices, officers speaking quickly into radios, calling for medical staff, reporting codes he recognized only from years of listening. Something had happened to David. Something that would later be documented quietly, without headlines, without attention, like so many unexplained events inside isolation units across the country. But Miguel didn't know the details yet. All he knew was the silence, the sudden alarms, and the terrifying realization that the last thing David ever did was try to warn him. And that is where this chapter ends, with Miguel standing alone, hands cuffed behind his back, staring into the fluorescent hallway, waiting to learn what really happened in the cell beside his. A truth Pelican Bay tried for years to keep inside its concrete walls. The door slammed shut behind Miguel as the officer stepped out of his cell, leaving him cuffed and standing in the middle of that cold, bright concrete box. The overhead light hummed, flickering just enough to make the shadows tremble on the floor. Every sound outside felt magnified, Boots, radios, the squeak of a gurney being rushed somewhere. Miguel didn't know if he was supposed to sit, kneel, stand, or wait for orders. In the SHU, hesitation could be mistaken for defiance. But movement could be mistaken for aggression. So Miguel stood still, breathing slow, listening. The hallway had gone quiet. Too quiet. Across the tier, something heavy rolled over the floor. Wheels, metal, maybe part of the emergency equipment brought into the SHU when something serious occurred. Miguel followed the sound with his ears, trying to figure out how close it was to cell 122. The officers had whispered earlier. Something went wrong in 122. Miguel knew what that usually meant. In a place like Pelican Bay where isolation carved deep scars into the mind, where a man could spend 23 hours a day in silence, where no sunlight touched your skin for months or years, when something went wrong, it was rarely simple. But from behind his perforated steel door, he had no answers. Just questions. And fear. Minutes earlier. In the SHU control booth, Officer Harrington switched the monitor feed from one pod to the next, checking cells manually. It was procedure. Routine. But routines inside Pelican Bay often revealed the unexpected. Most of the screens showed what they always showed: motionless concrete cells, men lying on bunks pacing slowly or sitting with their heads down. No sound. No color. Just that pale gray world the SHU became known for. But at cell 122 something caught his eye. The inmate inside, David Coleman, was not at the door, not on the bunk, not sitting. He was on the floor. Completely still. Officer Harrington zoomed in, leaning forward. He tapped the glass. "Hey Grant, come here." Officer Grant walked over. Younger, newer, less hardened by years in the SHU. When he saw the monitor he stiffened. "Is he breathing?" "Not sure," Harrington said. "But something's wrong." Within seconds they logged code 4, medical emergency. The SHU didn't panic easily. Codes were rare but taken seriously. 2 more officers grabbed keys and gear. Another called the medical unit. Nurses at Pelican Bay moved quickly. SHU emergencies didn't give second chances. As they approached the pod, they heard another noise, faint, rhythmic tapping from the neighboring cell. They ignored it at first. In the SHU, tapping happened sometimes. Men tried to communicate. It was against the rules, but it happened. But the tapping stopped abruptly. The silence afterward wasn't normal. It felt like a vacuum. Harrington keyed into cell 122 and pushed the door open. David Coleman lay on the floor, face pale, eyes half open but unfocused. His chest rose only slightly, shallow, irregular breaths. The cell smelled like the metallic air of concrete and artificial lighting, mixed with the faint chemical scent of institutional cleaner. Officer Grant checked for a pulse. "Wait. Ready. Get the nurse here now. Tell them to bring the full kit." "What about the neighbor?" Harrington asked. He was tapping like crazy. Grant shook his head. "Focus on this first." But deep down both men wondered the same thing. Why had the neighbor been tapping so frantically right before this happened? Miguel's. Standing alone in his cell, Miguel replayed the tapping in his mind. He knew rhythms. SHU inmates turned tapping into language. It was survival. What David tapped wasn't random. It was structured. It had meaning. Miguel didn't understand the exact message, but he remembered the pace. Fast, uneven, panicked. Like someone begging for help. Why hadn't he responded louder? Would it have mattered? Would the officers have come sooner? His thoughts spun, bouncing off the concrete walls like echoes that refused to fade. Then he heard it, the sharp metallic sound of restraints tightening. Somebody was being cuffed. Somebody was being lifted. Miguel stepped toward his door, cheek pressed to the perforations, trying to catch a glimpse of the corridor. He couldn't see much, just blurry shapes and shadows, but he could hear voices. "Lift him slow. Watch his head. We need medical now." They were pulling someone out of a cell. He knew exactly who. His throat tightened. David. A man who had barely spoken in years. A man swallowed by silence. A man whose last action was reaching out through concrete. Now being dragged past him on a gurney. Miguel closed his eyes. He didn't need to see it. He felt it. Transporting David. Nurse Stevens arrived first, gloves already on, medical kit partly unzipped, eyes scanning the scene. She knelt beside David instantly, checking reflexes, pulse, breathing. "He's barely responsive." "What happened?" she asked. "Found him like this," Officer Grant replied. "He was fine at count this morning. Quiet but fine." Stevens shined a penlight in David's eyes. No response. "We need to get him to the triage and treatment area now," she said. "Help me get him on the gurney." The officers followed protocol. Roll. Support. Lift. Secure. Everything done by the book, because in the SHU processes mattered. Mistakes turned into investigations. And investigations meant days of paperwork for everyone involved. Once David was strapped in, Stevens placed a mask over his face to stabilize his breathing. A portable oxygen tank hissed softly as she adjusted valves. Pulse is weak. Could be cardiac, could be neurological, could be... She stopped herself. In the SHU could be covered too many possibilities. As they wheeled him out, Officer Grant glanced toward Miguel's cell. The small, dark figure inside stood frozen, eyes locked on the gurney's wheels. Alvarez, Grant muttered quietly. Why were you tapping earlier? What did you hear? Miguel didn't answer. Grant didn't expect him to. He walked away. Miguel's. The hallway emptied again, leaving only distant echoes and the soft hum of air vents. The officers didn't return to uncuff him right away. That was normal. Emergencies changed routines. Miguel stood still, hands behind him, wrists burning against the metal restraints. He felt the weight of something he couldn't name, guilt, confusion, fear. He had known David for 8 years without ever speaking a word. Yet tonight, that man had reached out to him in desperation. What? Miguel replayed the tapping again, slow and careful this time, trying to decipher the rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. It wasn't standard code. Not the usual alphabet tapping SHU inmates used. Sounded more like a warning, or a plea, or both. And it came right before whatever happened in that cell. Minutes later, his door opened again. Officer Harrington stepped inside. Alvarez, he said calmly. Sit. Miguel obeyed immediately, sitting on the edge of his bunk while Harrington removed the cuffs. You didn't see anything, right? Miguel shook his head. No, sir. You hear anything? Miguel hesitated, only for a second. But inside the SHU a second felt suspicious. Just tapping, he said. From the wall. Harrington sighed. How long? Few minutes. Was he talking to you? Sending messages? Miguel shook his head quickly. No, sir. Just sounded different. Like he was scared. Harrington studied him for a moment. Then he stepped back toward the door. That's all. Don't leave your bunk until we finish the sweep. As the door slammed shut again, Miguel's chest tightened. A sweep meant they were searching cells, collecting reports, doing wellness checks, trying to understand what happened inside cell 122. Miguel lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Something told him none of this was over. The medical review. Down in the triage and treatment area, David Coleman lay under bright medical lights, hooked to wires and monitors. His pulse was faint but present. Dr. Rios, the facility physician, reviewed the initial readings. His vitals are unstable. Could be long-term isolation effects, could be a sudden collapse. Nurse Stevens nodded. He's deteriorated fast. I've been saying for years we need more mental health checks in the SHU. Dr. Rios sighed. I agree. But policy is policy. He paused. What about the neighbor? Alvarez? He heard tapping. That's all we've got. Rios looked up sharply. Tapping? Stevens nodded. Yeah. Duration unknown. Rios scribbled a note. How long has Coleman been in isolation? Since 2003, Stevens replied. 8 years straight. Rios closed the chart slowly. Then this wasn't sudden, he said quietly. This was a countdown. Miguel's nightfall. Back in his cell, Miguel finally felt the exhaustion hit. The lights dimmed slightly. Pelican Bay never went fully dark, but enough to signal that night had arrived. He wanted to sleep. He needed to sleep. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard the tapping. Not as it happened, but louder. Clear. More deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Almost like a heartbeat. He sat up again, breathing slow, trying to calm the shaking in his hands. He didn't know what happened to David. He didn't know if David survived the night. He didn't know if the tapping had been a message meant for him, or a cry no one else heard. And somewhere in the quiet of the SHU, deep in the concrete corridors, Miguel thought he heard something again. A single tap. Very soft. Very distant. Almost like an echo from a place that no longer existed. He turned toward the wall. Tap. Miguel froze. Tap, tap. It wasn't David's rhythm. It wasn't his tone. It wasn't the same cell. It was coming from somewhere else. In the SHU. Somebody else. Sending a message. The story was no longer about one man in cell 122. Something bigger had begun. And Miguel was now in the middle of it. The tapping continued, soft, deliberate, spaced apart like someone choosing each knock with purpose. Tap, pause, tap tap, tap. Miguel sat upright on his bunk, feet on the cold concrete floor, his heart thudding against his ribs. The SHU had rules. Rules about silence, rules about communication, rules about the invisible lines inmates weren't supposed to cross. And yet, tapping was the one rule that the walls could never fully stop. But this tapping wasn't normal. It didn't come from the direction of cell 122. And it didn't carry the panic, the desperation, the uneven fear that David had tapped with hours earlier. This tapping was controlled, measured, almost like someone was waiting for him to respond. Miguel swallowed hard. He knew answering could get him written up. He knew officers could check logs and punish inmates who tried to communicate. But he also knew something had happened to the man on the other side of that wall. Something so serious that officers had rushed, nurses had run, and half the tier had been searched afterward. And now someone else was tapping. Miguel leaned forward, placing his palm gently on the wall. He didn't tap back, not yet. He just listened. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythm. Not a cry for help. Not a random sound. A signal. Miguel recognized parts of it. It was similar to a code used in facilities decades earlier before officers cracked down on inmate communication. A hybrid between old-school wall tapping and improvised timing patterns. The message smelled like trouble, or a warning. But before Miguel could decode it completely, a large shadow slid past his cell door. He jerked back instantly. His breath caught in his throat. Footsteps. Slow, heavy ones. Boots. An officer was doing a late-night walkthrough. And the tapping stopped instantly. Just like that, gone. Miguel eased back onto his bunk and clasped his hands together, pretending to be asleep. In the SHU, pretending could save you from questions you didn't want to answer. The keys jingled as the officer peered into his cell. A flashlight beam brushed across Miguel's bed. Miguel kept his eyes closed, breathing steady. After a few seconds, the beam moved on. The boots faded. The hallway fell into tense quiet again. But the tapping didn't return. And Miguel knew that when communication stopped suddenly like that, it wasn't out of fear. It was because the person tapping had seen something. Or heard something. And was waiting for the right moment to continue. Miguel lay awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, trying to decode a message he'd barely heard, and wondering why more than one man on this tier suddenly wanted to reach him. The incident report. While Miguel wrestled with the silence, a very different scene was unfolding inside the administrative wing on the other side of the SHU. Officer Harrington leaned over a metal desk in the incident review room, pen in hand, filling out the first half of what would become a very long night of documentation. Incident reports, medical logs, emergency response forms, camera reviews, everything had to be recorded when a SHU inmate was transported out of his cell unresponsive. Across from him sat Lieutenant Shaw, a strict officer known for his meticulous attention to detail. Shaw had been in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, for over 2 decades. Pelican Bay was his world. The SHU was his kingdom. And paperwork was his language. Start from the beginning, Shaw said, voice calm but commanding. Harrington nodded. Cell 122. Inmate Coleman. Observed lying on the floor at approximately 1938 hours during a routine monitor check. Shaw tapped his pen. Any signs of self-harm? Struggle? Contraband? No. None visible. Any disturbances earlier in the day? Complaints? Requests? Harrington hesitated. There was tapping from the neighboring cell right before we entered. Shaw's eyes sharpened. Tapping? Yes, sir. From which cell? Alvarez. Cell 123. Shaw leaned back slowly. Alvarez, he repeated, rubbing his chin. He's been stable for years. No major incidents. Correct. Shaw lowered his voice slightly. And Coleman? Harrington exhaled. 8 years straight in SHU. Minimal contact. History of insomnia. Occasional mental health concerns. Nothing recent on record. Shaw finished writing and closed the folder. We'll need to talk to Alvarez tomorrow, he said. Officially. Think he had something to do with it? Shaw shook his head. No. But he may have heard something. He paused. And if he heard something? He looked up at Harrington. Then someone else might have heard something too. Miguel's, the next morning. The morning light in the SHU wasn't light at all, just a slightly brighter shade of artificial white that buzzed overhead. Miguel hadn't slept more than an hour, maybe less. His mind kept replaying the tapping, David's collapse, the officer's rush, the distant echo that followed. Breakfast came through the slot, A tray of oatmeal, a small box of milk, a slice of bread. Routine. Always routine. Miguel pushed the food aside. His stomach was knotted too tightly to eat. Then he heard keys. Several sets. Multiple officers walked the tier at once. That wasn't normal. Morning checks usually involved 2 officers. But today the air carried more footsteps, more voices. Miguel sat straight back against the wall. Lieutenant Shaw appeared at his door. He was flanked by Officer Grant and another officer Miguel didn't recognize. Shaw spoke first. Alvarez. On your feet. Miguel stood immediately. Back up to the door. He followed instruction without hesitation. Hands behind him. Palms together. Grant cuffed him through the slot with smooth, practiced movements. Step away and face the back wall, Shaw said. Miguel complied. The door opened. For a moment, the hallway felt blinding after the dimness of his cell. Officers stood spaced out along the tier, watching, alert. Alvarez, Shaw said, we're taking you to the interview room. No disciplinary action. Just questions. Miguel nodded, trying not to look nervous. But inside his chest tightened. Questions meant something had escalated. As they escorted him down the tier, he glanced, just once, at the cell where David had lived for 8 long years. The door to cell 122 was closed. But the small window was covered by a sheet of paper taped from inside the hallway. That only happened after serious incidents. Miguel swallowed hard. Then as they passed the next cell, he heard it. Tap tap. Soft. Hidden. Quick. He didn't look. He couldn't look. But he knew one thing for certain. The tapping wasn't coming from cell 122. It was coming from deeper in the tier. And whoever was tapping picked this moment on purpose. The interview room. The SHU interview room wasn't actually a room. It was a small concrete space with a metal table bolted to the floor and a camera mounted in the corner. Everything recorded. Everything preserved. Lieutenant Shaw sat on one side of the table. Miguel sat on the other, wrists cuffed to a metal ring. Shaw folded his hands. Alvarez, he began, we want to clarify a few details about last night. Nothing disciplinary. Just information. Miguel nodded. Shaw studied him carefully. You reported hearing tapping from cell 122 before the incident. Miguel chose his words carefully. Not too detailed. Not too vague. Yes, sir. It sounded urgent. Urgent how? Miguel shook his head slowly. Fast. Repeated. Like someone wanted attention. Grant stepped forward from the wall behind Shaw. And what about after the incident? Miguel kept his face still. After? No, sir. I didn't hear anything after. Shaw's eyes flicked up to Miguel's. You're sure? Miguel nodded. Because he knew the truth. If he admitted he'd heard tapping again this morning, they would isolate him even deeper. Maybe move him. Maybe investigate him. Maybe label him a problem. Miguel had survived this place for 15 years by choosing silence wisely. Shaw scribbled a note. All right. One more question. He leaned closer. Why do you think Coleman was tapping to you specifically? Miguel hesitated. The answer felt obvious, but he knew he had to phrase it safely. Maybe, because I was the only one close enough to hear. Shaw watched him for a long moment, long enough for the silence to grow heavy. Then Shaw nodded once. That's all. We'll return you to your cell. But as Officer Grant uncuffed him from the ring, Shaw added. Let us know if you hear anything else. Anything at all. Miguel nodded again. But inside he knew one thing. He wouldn't be telling them anything. Not until he understood what was happening. Miguel's returned to the tier. When they brought him back, Miguel noticed something new. 2 officers were standing outside a cell farther down the tier, cell 118. One officer held paperwork. The other had a handheld camera, recording the cell door and the interior through the perforations. That only happened during investigations. Miguel's pulse quickened. Cell 118. He searched his memory of rhythms, voices, coughs, footsteps. The tapping this morning? Yes, it came from that direction. Was that the man who tapped the message? Were they interviewing him too? Did something happen to him as well? As Miguel walked past, he kept his face neutral, eyes forward. But inside, electricity shot through his thoughts. Something was spreading on this tier. Something officers didn't understand. Something inmates were trying to communicate about. And whatever it was, it started long before David collapsed. Files that didn't match. Back in the administrative wing, Lieutenant Shaw pulled up the records for cell 118. Inside lived an inmate named Ronald R.J. Jefferson, 38 years old, in SHU since 2008. Medical records, stable. Behavioral logs, quiet. Mental health notes, minimal. But last week, a note had been added. Inmate reported trouble sleeping. States he hears something in the walls. No signs of distress. Observation recommended. Shaw tapped the screen. He didn't like coincidences. First Coleman hearing things. Now Jefferson. And one man ends up unresponsive. He exhaled slowly. Something was happening in this tier. Something quiet. Something inmates sensed but officers couldn't see. Not yet. Miguel's, the tapping returns. Hours later, Miguel sat on the floor of his cell, knees drawn up, eyes closed. He tried to calm his breathing, but the SHU didn't allow peace easily. And then, tap tap. Miguel's eyes snapped open. The same rhythm. Same pattern. Coming from cell 118. But this time, something was different. The tapping was slower. Calmer. Almost like the person on the other side was waiting for Miguel to respond. Miguel hesitated. Responding was dangerous. But silence was a choice too. And sometimes silence killed. He lifted his hand. Pressed his knuckles to the wall. And for the first time since the night everything changed. Miguel tapped back. One tap. Just one. A question. And instantly, tap tap. A reply. Miguel leaned in, heart pounding. The rhythm continued, barely audible, almost like a whisper in the concrete. A message. Miguel listened, decoding what little he could. The taps formed a phrase short and chilling. You're next. Miguel's breath froze. Next for what? Before he could respond. Keys rattled. Boots approached. And the tapping stopped. The keys echoed down the tier, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Miguel froze, palms pressed flat against the concrete wall. The tapping had stopped immediately when the officer's footsteps sounded, as if the walls themselves had been listening. He backed away from the wall, sitting quickly on his bunk and facing forward, trying to look calm. But inside his chest was hammering. You're next. Those were the last taps he heard. A message simple enough to understand, but impossible to ignore. Next for what? Next to collapse like Coleman? Next to lose his grip on reality? Next to feel the isolation swallowing him whole? Miguel didn't know. He only knew the tapping wasn't random. It had structure, purpose, intention. And now, he wasn't the only one who heard it. A growing pattern. Lieutenant Shaw and Officer Grant stood inside the control booth, scanning the monitor feeds for irregularities. Shaw had reviewed 3 incident reports, 2 medical logs, and half an hour's worth of surveillance footage. Nothing connected. Nothing obvious. But Shaw had worked too long inside Pelican Bay to believe in coincidences. A man collapses in cell 122. Another inmate reports hearing things in cell 118. Then a third inmate, Alvarez, shows signs of agitation despite years of stable behavior. Shaw leaned closer to the monitors. You hear anything on your walkthroughs this morning? He asked Grant. Grant hesitated. I might have heard something faint from 118, he admitted. Could have been pipes. Could have been someone tapping. Shaw rubbed his forehead. 3 cells. Same tier. Same week. Grant lowered his voice. You think something's spreading? Shaw didn't answer immediately. Isolation did strange things to the human mind. Officers weren't blind to that. They saw the long-term effects every day, men pacing until their feet cracked, others whispering to themselves, some losing track of time entirely. But this felt different. Too synchronized. Too specific. If one inmate spirals, Shaw said finally, it's mental health. If 2 do, maybe coincidence. But 3? At the same time? On the same block. He closed the file slowly. That's a pattern. A decision. Hours passed. No tapping returned. No voices. No warnings. Miguel sat on his floor, elbows on his knees, staring at the wall that connected him to cell 118. He replayed each tap, each pause, each rhythm, trying to decode more meaning. But the only phrase he was sure of was, "You're next." Miguel pressed his fingertips to the concrete. Next for what? He whispered to himself. No answer. His mind raced through possibilities, medical, psychological, environmental. The SHU was notorious for extreme isolation. Men in the unit sometimes reported strange sensations. Vibrations in pipes. Shifts in air pressure. Faint clicks from the mechanical systems. Electrical hums that played tricks on the brain. But tapping? Coordinated tapping? Warnings? That wasn't machinery. Miguel leaned back against his bunk and closed his eyes. He had survived 15 years in this place by understanding one thing. Everything in the SHU has a meaning. The silence has meaning. The The sounds have meaning. The pauses have meaning. A man doesn't tap a warning unless he knows something. Miguel stood slowly, walked to the wall again, placed his hand against it, and tapped once. Just one. A question. A plea. A connection. But this time there was no answer. Not a single tap. The silence returned. Heavy. Thick. Final. The check on cell 118. Lieutenant Shaw headed directly to cell 118 with Officer Grant and 2 backup staff members. They stood outside Jefferson's cell, listening carefully. Nothing. Grant knocked on the steel door. Jefferson. Stand up for count. No response. Jefferson. Respond. Again, nothing. Shaw signaled to Grant. Open it. The door slid open with a low mechanical groan. Jefferson lay on his bunk, eyes open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Not moving. Not reacting. Not blinking. Shaw's stomach tightened. Jefferson. Look at me. Finally, Jefferson blinked, slowly, almost painfully. Grant stepped forward. You okay? Jefferson swallowed hard, then whispered something almost inaudible. What was that? Grant asked. Jefferson's eyes shifted, just barely, toward the wall between his cell and Miguel's. Then he whispered again. The walls aren't quiet anymore. Shaw's expression hardened. Call medical. Now. The realization. When the alarms went off again, short bursts signaling a medical response, Miguel knew exactly where officers were heading. Cell 118. He climbed onto his bunk, straining to see through the tiny holes in his door. Officers rushed past. Nurses followed. A stretcher rolled loudly across the floor. Miguel's chest tightened. 2 men on the same tier. 2 mental collapses. Within 12 hours. And both had tried to reach him. He sank onto the floor, letting the weight of everything press down on him. The tapping wasn't random. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a trick of isolation. It was a warning. A chain reaction. A signal from men who were trapped inside a place designed to break them slowly. Miguel closed his eyes and breathed deeply. If he didn't pay attention, if he ignored the signs, if he stayed silent, he wouldn't just be next for a breakdown. He'd be next for the silence. The kind that swallowed David. And Jefferson. He opened his eyes. No more pretending. Miguel Alvarez, inmate of the Pelican Bay SHU for 15 years, was in danger. Not from another inmate. Not from a gang. Not from the officers. But from the place itself. The walls. The silence. The isolation. Miguel stood, placing his palm flat against the concrete again. Not to tap, not to ask, not to seek, but to affirm to himself what he already knew. He needed to survive the SHU before the SHU consumed him. He stepped back from the wall and sat on his bunk, staring straight ahead. The tapping wouldn't return. The warnings had been delivered. The results were already happening. Now for Miguel. It was a race against time. A race to keep his mind intact. A race to stay grounded. A race to avoid becoming the next that those walls promised. And as the evening lights dimmed across the SHU, Miguel made a silent vow. He would fight back. Not with violence. Not with rebellion. But with the one weapon men in the SHU rarely had. Awareness. Because once you understand what's happening, you can't be broken the same way. Inside Pelican Bay's SHU, silence is not just the absence of sound. It's a pressure. A presence. A force that grows heavier with every hour, every day, every year in isolation. Men like Miguel, Coleman, and Jefferson live in a space where the mind becomes both companion and enemy. Where tapping on a wall becomes conversation. Where shadows become warnings. Where silence becomes a language of its own. The collapse of 2 inmates in less than 24 hours wasn't just a coincidence. It was a snapshot of a system stretched beyond its limits, and of human beings reaching their breaking point. And as Miguel sits alone in his cell, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echoes of officers' boots, one truth becomes painfully clear. In a place built to control the body, it's the mind that must fight to stay alive.